This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. PLI is committed to keeping you ever current on topics that matter to you, like artificial intelligence. Learn more at pli.edu/AIPod.
Welcome to AI and Data Law, part of the PLI Evercurrent podcast. I'm William Tanenbaum, host of the podcast and head of AI and data practice at Moses & Singer in New York. In this series, we bring you the latest perspectives on AI and data through timely talks with thought leaders working at the intersection of AI, data, and the law. In this episode, my guest is Liz Grennan, a partner and the global co-leader of digital trust at McKinsey Co. Our topic is the velocity of change in generative AI business use cases. Liz and I have known each other in her roles at McKinsey for a long time and have been professional colleagues. And we've had discussions, of course, about AI and data in the past. And Liz has said some things that I think are pretty interesting in discussing how fast things are moving and how companies are trying to keep up with the pace of change. Liz has called this the Wild, Wild West, and she's called it the Wild, Wild West on Mars, which I think is a pretty interesting way to look at this. And Liz has also said that in her observation from as a partner at McKinsey, that businesses are moving very, very fast, and there's some challenges for lawyers to keep up with what the businesses are doing. So we'll circle back to that. But before we go any further, since Liz has had some interesting things in her career arc, Liz, why don't you tell us what you're doing now and a couple of the things you did on your way to what you're doing now?
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for having me. Yes, I am a partner at McKinsey, and I thus am a consultant, but I have spent the majority of my career as a practicing lawyer. So I started in big law doing M&A, and then went to my first analytics startup a few years into my practice, and that was in the intelligence community. We then sold that company, and I went back to big law doing M&A, and then went back to a startup, ultimately joining McKinsey as its first analytics lawyer. And I led legal and risk globally for McKinsey Digital, and I switched to the consulting side specifically because the issues of operationalizing what we call digital trust, we can talk about that. There's so much to do that is strategy and implementation, and just goes beyond the legal advice that one would give, that it made sense to me to make the shift over. And I'm very happy I did.
Well, I know that it's been very successful for you, and you've had some interesting work based on our past discussions. But to jump in the podcast, I'm really kind of interested in what you see on the velocity of change, and in particular with respect to generative AI uses and what companies are doing and what's on the immediate horizon.
I think the legal term is it's bananas. It really is, though. It's an inflection point in time where we can't ignore what is happening and how fast it's happening. I think people have known about, the need to manage data, govern data, and data privacy. Of course, we're years into that compliance, arc. But folks had started to think about AI, governance and AI compliance, but it just was not front burner. I think with the tipping point of Gen AI, folks realized the value is too great to bypass the opportunity, but the train tracks were not in place to govern something as fast moving and is so uncertain as generative AI. And when I say uncertain, both the evolution of the technology itself and the second and third order implications of the risks that come from the use, they're just not well understood by anybody. And I think that creates a new need for every organization to develop almost like systems design around its functions to advise on this, because it needs to be new and incredibly agile. So there's a very big set of implications for legal and risk and cyber and privacy, all the functions that would really govern the use of AI.
Yeah, and since I know you're a partner who's a consultant, I'd be interested in some of your observations of what business is doing as well. I know when I started this a couple of months ago, when ChatGPT burst into view, initially our clients were, how do we protect ourselves against the disclosure of trade secrets? And how do we really put a lot of boundaries against the use of this? And I would say within 2 months, everybody saw some great use cases. And the legal question became, how do we put guardrails on these use cases that we want to do? The things I'm seeing in generative AI, include knowledge management, business intelligence, a lot of things that would do with internal efficiency, is a supercharged form of automation. And then also some things in the area of, how can we do things that we didn't do before? Mm-hmm. How can we speed up code writing? How can we speed up R&D? But anyhow, I'd like to turn this back over to you, and obviously not ask you to reveal any ongoing projects or clients of McKinsey, but in some generic industry trends, what kind of use cases do you see are getting a lot of consideration from, companies in general?
Sure. I'll share my perspective and say, disclaim this is not McKinsey's perspective, but my own. I think we all saw in sort of the public domain, there were organizations that froze, that said, we're banning it. No one's using it. This is we can't manage it, so we're not going to allow it. And we saw that in countries. There are a variety of responses around the world. And then I think to your point around how many use cases are just so valuable, that became so persuasive. And I think that really have the boards and the C-suite saying, what are we going to do here? And how are you managing it? So there's a need for organizations to turn around and say, every division, for instance, give us the 2 most high value use cases for each business unit, and please just tell us your implementation plan. And then the board saying, what are we doing, and how are you managing it? And they're both asking those questions at the same pace and speed. So then the question becomes, it's a race to productivity, it's a race to application and implementation. But then who's going to own the governance part of this? And there are so many facets to the governance here that this ownership question becomes a real sticking point, and it becomes an area where organizations are just really struggling to try to put a plan together, not only the controls themselves, but the ownership of the controls.
And I'm interested in what you're seeing about who owns this and who governs this.
That's a great question. It's not, my personal perspective has been, I still am a lawyer. Sometimes you'd think that chief risk officer would own it. Sometimes you'd think the general counsel would own it. My sense is that in an organization, everything is driven by incentives. So chief data officer, chief analytics officer, the chief information officer, those are the folks who are putting their sponsorship, time, money, effort, people, talent behind AI and data use cases. They are the ones who want that to go, be successful. Their own performance is riding on it. Their organization, that's what they're doing as their central focus. To me, they are the most incented to get the risk part right, because they know, I think that folks intuitively know, this is where you need that, better brakes makes for faster acceleration metaphor. You need this to be shored up. You need a foundation in place. Fast and loose on this comes back to haunt people. And so I think that those are the ones I think are the pointy tip of the spear in ownership, because they are just incented to make this go well. I don't think it's far. I don't even know if the next calendar year this will be owned by risk. I think it will continue to be owned by, data and analytics officers, and maybe there's new roles of head of AI. But I think organizationally dependent, there will be for sure, these sort of rainbow coalition, if you will, of leaders across different functions and across different business units coming together to govern this. So you might see a chief privacy officer with general counsel, with the chief risk, all weighing in with chief information and the CISO and chief data working together on that leadership level. So it goes with the SWAT teams that will help govern this. You need the data scientists and the developers and the lawyers who are like the tech lawyers and the cyber folks, the privacy folks, all working together in kind of a SWAT team of first responders. It's a triage moment when you pursue a use case, and they come together to try to put together what would be, a fit for purpose at that moment in time governance approach. And that evolves very quickly. So not only does the tech evolve, but the controls themselves, what's best in class, that evolves. And So developing those SWAT teams that are always scanning the horizon, knowing that they're meant to evolve, on a maybe it's even monthly basis, if quarterly, monthly, but something much, much faster than the typical sort of annual policy review and typical pace that a function might have.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing also. And I think what Gen AI, and we'll come back to machine learning in a moment, but it's going fast, and it's an environment where there are multiple stakeholders. As far as organizing the tech, there's multiple vendors, and there's multiple, sometimes inconsistent, or at least use cases that kind of conflict with each other, or assuming no business problem from who is doing what at the business unit level, put a lot of pressure on the data folks to be able to give the kind of data that you want. And, I've been known to say that data doesn't manage itself. So, an AI abhors a vacuum. So you can't do AI without data. You can't do AI without data you trust.
That's right.
You can't do AI with data that's, legacy data and not really relevant. So, there is a role, and an important one, for bringing in the data organization, which I'll just say parenthetically is usually not part of the IT organization.
That's right.
It's at big enterprises.
That's right.
And that's what I was meaning by, multiple stakeholders, and they've got to coordinate.
And you raise a good point. I guess 2 points I wanted to raise, which is, how do organizations react? It depends on what do they have in place already. So highly regulated organizations, say banks or insurance companies, they will have had a model risk management function. They will have had, they already have compliance set up across a whole variety of requirements. So for those organizations, mobilization is not tricky because they already have folks. I think it's just sort of shifting ways of working, maybe tweaking operating models, building on top of what's there. You still have the ownership problem, or the challenge to solve. But I think it's the organizations that did not do that, like an organization that doesn't have a chief data officer and their data is sort of siloed and not well governed, and they don't have an AI like function, governance function yet. That's where it's tricky, because you really are starting from scratch on a lot of things. The second thing that you raised, which I think is sort of where we live now, even if an organization is not pursuing use cases in Gen AI or any AI use cases, every vendor, you're in a world where every vendor, not every, but like many vendors are choosing to employ AI and Gen AI, and that's part of their value proposition, is that they are AI powered, and that vendor community serves the world. So these are the waters in which we now swim. This is AI powered, and every organization at the very least has to sort through third-party risk management on the AI front, because it's a new level of diligence, a new set of reps and warranties that you'll want to ask them to, sign. And beyond that, even just the auditing and monitoring to make sure that they're doing what they should they're doing. And that, you assume, evolves again very quickly. So that's why auditing and monitoring of the third-party risk environment is key, because one should assume that the increased use of AI in services and products will increase. And an organization has to understand what's coming at them, like what is in their vendor community, what is in these products and services they consume from third parties. So there's really no way around it at this point.
And I think that's a very interesting point, because I think to the extent that, you're bringing in a sophisticated vendor who's applying their model to your data, you've got two issues. One, your data may contain trade secrets of your business partners or customers, under which that is, the prime company, is responsible for acting in accordance with those confidentiality and non-disclosure obligations. But what happens when you run a model against that data? If the data doesn't tag that model, those particular databases or other elements of data as being subject to confidentiality agreements, then if your vendor runs the model about that, what really happens? I'm not sure anybody knows, but I'll ask you if you know. When you take the
we have sort of the taker, shaper, maker trifecta, which is taker, you're just using the open source sort of versions of like a ChatGPT or a Claude or a Bard, and then the shapers are creating their own closed instances, and presumably in those closed instances that are sort of enterprise specific, presumably you've stipulated that that data, the training data that you put into the model, will not be put back in the public domain. And can you know that it is not? I don't know. I think you'll need to rely on contracts and diligence and reputational, desire to maintain reputation. But yes, every organization has its own contractual obligations to keep data, as secure, private, whatever the constraints that come with it. And it's on the organization to make sure that the running through a model or running through any third-party software doesn't violate the covenants that they've promised to keep. So, and then of course the makers themselves are just those making their own LLMs, which is just incredibly costly. So very few are doing so. So I think really you're talking maybe the takers and the shapers, and what are you doing? So I think to ensure the safety of the data you're using as training data, you'll need to be very closely focused on, what are they saying happens, and both from legal controls, organizational controls, and technical controls. You want all three to make sure that you shore it up as much as possible.
So I'm sure you're seeing a lot of evolution into that kind of corporate governance and that structure around those things. I mean, my comment about taking data would be data with confidential information subject to non-disclosure obligations would be, that kind of pushes it back to the data organization to make sure that the data is appropriately treated, which means doing data magic to data stuff. Ironically enough, or maybe not at all ironically, but predictably enough, those data organizations are going to use AI to identify what shouldn't be part of AI.
I know. I mean, that's the thing. It's productivity on every front. But yes, did you say the data magic? Yes, totally. Yeah. The data organization has to have all their ducks in a row right now. They need to know where all the data is, that it is tagged, that they, data governance, which is not super sexy of a topic, it becomes a sort of a conditioned precedent, if you will, to Gen AI readiness. And so people focus on it because they need it. It's the fuel. Data, well-governed data, well-governed data always contributed to robustness of insights anyway, from an analytics standpoint. So there was always a reason for it. It just becomes now, much more acute. Like, where is it? What can we use? What have we said we can't use? Is it tagged? And I think that's where people are really rushing right now. And I guess I would say, I don't think anyone's really rushing to get great data governance or even rushing to get perfect AI governance. I think folks are taking it piecemeal and saying, okay, we definitely know we want to pursue this particular use case. So what do we need to do for this particular use case? And they're taking it kind of use case by use case, which is totally fair and good in pilot settings, because it's cabined. The risk is cabined. The impact ultimately will be cabined. But as you scale, that's when you have to build all these programs out. I think it's much more exciting and rewarding to build the programs out if you are building them in order to execute on a particular strategy that you are interested in pursuing versus blanket compliance requirements, which are not super interesting. They are good and healthy, but I think if you know the win that you are hoping to gain, and this underpins that win, it's much more likely that folks will get, focused on this.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies are looking for quick wins, and a lot of people are smart enough to do what you've said, which is to define a narrow case and then organize around that. It's been interesting to talk about how you can't do this without the data organization being proud of the effort.
Yeah.
But I'd like to kind of shift, if we can, to addressing the dangers of AI when there's not really transparency into the model or the training set, and seeing some companies fine-tune their own models and then do prompt engineering to make sure that they're kind of optimizing for task-specific objectives which reflect what the company's strategy is or what the industry needs. And that's an observation from a lawyer. Now I'm interested from an observation from a McKinsey partner on, trends along those lines.
What are you seeing as a lawyer?
Well, I'm seeing that having more control over your large language model and making it more curated reduces the risk of, inadvertent legal problems. to take a sideways step, if you're just bringing in a third-party vendor without doing careful management of your own data, what you're really doing is relying on that vendor's privacy policy to keep you in compliance with your privacy problem.
I mean,
so,
this is, I guess I liken it to, I heard this analogy, I wish it were mine, but it's not, but I love it. When you drive over a bridge, you drive your car over a bridge, you are keenly aware of the value of engineering and math that went into the creation of that bridge and the construct, the materials, et cetera. You really just assume and you hope that it was sound. It is such an intangible to say, like from a responsible AI or an ethical data perspective, what's that bridge you're driving over? And what went into the creation of the safety controls that will carry you from, beginning of the life cycle of the model to the end. I think unfortunately, it's one of those things that usually gets acted on when there's pain. So like a large fine, for instance, I think that's what we saw in the GDPR arc. You'd see organizations understand their compliance requirements from privacy, but then it's really just knowing like, oh gosh, that hit could be, this amount if you apply GDPR's fine structure. And we see that now with AI Act, the fine structure is even higher. So I think it is something where the best way that I guide clients, if they are not driven by pain, which is the ideal, right? It is saying, what is the story that you want to tell about the creation of the bridge, to use that analogy? It's like, what do you want to be explained to whatever whatever level of scrutiny? So regulatory scrutiny, of course, consumer scrutiny, your customers, watchdog organization, states attorneys general, class action lawsuits. There's all sorts of look backs that you should expect if something does go wrong. So, if there's a crack in the bridge, and you'll want to be able to explain, these are the materials, this is the data, this is the health of the data, this is the test that we ran, this is our data governance protocols, this is our AI development protocols, these are the output reviews that we did for disparate impact on protected classes. This is where we tested for, did we have the consents that were required for the use case that we process the data for this analytical use case. Those tests, that storytelling, and then did the talent that we employed along the use case lifecycle, did they have the requisite skill? Like, did we hire people that knew what they were doing? Did we have the right talent? Did someone own these things? How do you explain your work? And the documentation standards that the EU AI Act will require, help folks along the storytelling. I guess I would say, but I don't know that those protocols and sort of muscle memory is there yet. I think it's there from like PIAs, that folks have been doing in privacy impact assessments, but I think that there will have to be a new level of collaboration between and among, legal and the developers, et cetera, and others, talking through, algorithmic impact assessments. And then just walking through. It doesn't necessarily need to be a lawyer who does the IA, but there'll need to be some understanding of legal. Legal has to understand tech. Tech has to understand legal. That is a non-negotiable in this new environment. And so the level of collaboration on those two fronts, and I'm using tech and legal because I am a lawyer who's now in tech, but of course there's also like, do you understand the cybersecurity requirements and the expanded, surface area of the threat? Do you understand the IT protocols and what's in place? So there are multiple players in this pod structure, but I think just kind of working backwards from storytelling. What do you want to say that you did within the technical constraints that, to knowing it's still black box, but within those technical constraints, what did you do?
I very much like that analogy of a bridge because, I don't know, the analogy it brings to mind is, a couple of years ago, we all used maps and stuff that we got from the Automobile Association to get around. Now we're using navigation systems, which sort of work and sort of work really well and sometimes don't. And I think AI is kind of like that. I mean, it's just going to be, it's in your car, it's going to be in your business, and you're not going back to maps again. It's just too enticing. So what I want to end on is just asking you what responsible AI seems to mean in the industries that you're seeing. Because we've all kind of heard the phrase, and I'm just kind of interested in having you be a conduit from industry to lawyers.
I guess I would say you could define it from a variety of angles, but I'll take the consumer angle because we are all consumers. Responsible AI is the faith that a consumer has that the company it's patronizing, that's getting its goods and services from, has handled its data in a way that is fair, transparent, explainable. They've done what they said they would do. They have not done things they were not allowed to do. So it's confidence in an organization's handling of our own personal data. And when they are pursuing sort of the AI output that they'll make decisions on, that there's a fairness element to it. So that they've taken into account, if they make a series of, if they have pattern recognition on a particular area, and that pattern happens to implicate, women or those with celiac or lawyers or, people who live in Fairfield County, whatever it is. I'm just taking my own demographic, but I don't want to be systematically excluded from a variety of things. Much less do I want to live in a society where marginalized people who get systematically excluded from a variety of things. That's a society that none of us want to live in. So I think understanding that they have taken into account the full spectrum of risks, the full spectrum of covenants they've made, and what they've said that they would do, and that they've followed they've made good on their promises for these things. That they've been thoughtful, methodical, and they've thought through second order implications so that I'm treated fairly when I deal with them. That was a longer answer than you were asking.
I think it's very important. And, I want to end today by saying you were very thoughtful and methodical. And, the insights are very valuable. So, Liz, thanks so much for your time. And I'm sure everyone will appreciate your comments.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be here.
Thanks for listening to AI and Data Law, part of the PLI Evercurrent podcast. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast represent those of the host and individuals being interviewed, and not necessarily those of PLI. For more AI-related content from the Practicing Law Institute, visit pli.edu/AIPod.